A very good morning to you all, ladies and gentlemen. Lieutenant General D.P. Pandey, General Officer Commanding Chinar Corps, Lieutenant General Bhatt, former Chinar Corps Commander, very distinguished gathering over here, people highly experienced from the Army, from the Police, CRPF, and our very dear friends from Kashmir who belong to Kashmir, whether residing or not is quite immaterial as long as their heart is here. And I suppose, as the Corps Commander pointed out, you are here to bring Kashmir back to genuine peace. We are here, as we all know, to discuss this topic called overground workers. Let me remind you, ladies and gentlemen, that if you were to drop one drop of watercolor black and onto that one drop of watercolor white, within no time you will find it turns to grey. Unless it is checked, it turns to grey. You can try the experiment with oil color, you can try it with paint, do what you will. Unless you keep the definition between black and white, the grey will take charge. And as we see a semblance of peace returning to Kashmir, we are seeing the expansion of the grey. And that, I think, is, topical, and I'm so glad that you have chosen to strike at this grey of the OGW, because you've done your bit, I think, in handling the black so far. You see the varying definitions, and particularly it comes from the police, because we got to admit it that the term OGW is quite unique to this Union territory now. It is not there in the Northeast. This is a coinage of the police which other security forces have picked up. Why was it coined? Perhaps at the end of the discourse from my very distinguished panelists, you'll get a sense why it has come about. But things like anyone who supports militants, an unarmed militant. And there was yet another interesting definition. The OGW, if the militant is the fish, OGW is the water on which the fish survives. So you see the wide array. Isn't it so ironical that anyone who supports militants is an OGW, but anyone who supports the cause of militancy is not classified as an OGW? Won't it get more grey than this? I quite recollect an incident after exiting from 15 Corps physically. Mentally, you never exit 15 Corps. After exiting 15 Corps physically, as Deputy Chief, I had come to Kashmir with a group of industrialists and academicians. So we were on our way to Toothmari Gali, 17 Brigade headquarters. En route, we stopped at 32 RR, not for breakfast, I promise you. It was because of some stone pelting that was going on. We stopped at a COB. So here was this young company commander of 32 RR who was asked this question by Professor Mishra of IIT Bombay. Professor Mishra asked him, Major, what is your, these terrorists must be a real problem for you. What did this Major have to respond? He said, Professor, a terrorist is the last of my problems. Because if I see him, he won't survive. But people who come around pelting stones, people who come around vilifying, vitiating the minds of my people, I really don't know how to handle them. He did give a solution. I don't go into that because it's not in the chart, in the scope of activity today. We can talk about it over tea. I bring it out to state that actually it gets complex when we enter this grey zone. And as military people particularly, frankly, this is not something that we are adept at. So it's just as well that you have picked up this topic to talk about it, discuss it. And as the Corps Commander brought out a little while back, it has only got much more complicated with white-collar terrorists, white-collar, the Corps Commander calls them white-collar terrorists, the DGP calls them white-collar jihadis, and here we are discussing them under the broader canvas of OGW. So look at the confusion that persists even on this. So fundamentally, I think finally we seem to be giving a correction to that so-called understanding of OGW from anyone who supports militants to anyone who supports militancy. And I'm glad that you're giving this correction, because unless you take care of militancy, militant is only a small element of the larger sense of militancy, if you will. So I think that is important. I do not need to tell you what all an OGW does, starting from recruiting the local terrorists to facilitating infiltration of the foreign terrorists, to being their eyes, ears, everything. And all of us in our times here have seen how they have operated here. I mean, the names of the likes of Fayaz of Letpura, Manzoor of Letpura, Yusuf from Gadura are all well known, who have supported and operated on the operational side. We all have lived through this, haven't we? So the point which I am trying to make in a much lighter vein is, I think as security forces, we need to take the call, and the point in a lighter vein is, within the circles of the security forces, it is often said that if you start arresting all the sources, you will probably drop down the terrorism by at least 70 to 80%. So I leave that thought with you, even though it is said in lighter vein, but there is a sense in what is being said. Now, how OGWs are enrolled, again I'm sure the speakers will speak, but sometimes, as the Corps Commander was bringing out, you may have heard of the famous Yunus Bakery of Tral. A fellow who was just running a bakery in the middle of Tral, initially coerced into providing food, eventually gets fascinated by the glamour of the terrorist and the gun, chooses to start supporting till he actually becomes one and gets eliminated. So, I mean, there can be many ways, but then there are definite trends which I would expect that my panelists would be covering, like some groups like the Jash probably prefer to work with their old associates, and Hizbul probably prefers to operate with friends and relatives. So how you are kind of working on them in your own areas of responsibility, I think requires a deeper knowledge of this. Should somebody want, we can talk about it more when we have the Q&A session at the end. On that note, I will stop here and hand you over to our first of the panelists, who will probably help us to demystify from all that we have just been spoken about. He's a very well-read person with a number of books to his credit. So it's over to you, Mr. Bashir.